There are almost 2.3 million people incarcerated in this country every day. They are housed in closed cages where physical distancing is impossible, hand sanitizer is banned, food is prepared and served by people who may be sick, toilets and showers are used by hundreds of other people, and things like soap and regular access to running water are often unavailable. 500,000 people, staff and guards, move in and out of jails and prisons every day and then return back into their communities. These numbers make it impossible to contain the virus once it enters a jail or prison. Once inside, it quickly spreads around the facility, after which staff themselves carry it back and forth into the surrounding communities. Given that the United States has more than 2,800 county jails, this is a public health crisis. So we have an immediate threat. And in response to that immediate threat, Chesa Boudin has led the way to reduce the jail population in San Francisco. Also in response to this immediate threat, Supervisor Sandra Fewer introduced legislation to speed up the closure of a county jail in San Francisco, the notorious County Jail 4 at 850 Bryant Street, referred to on the streets as simply 850. This past Tuesday, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors voted 10-1 in support of Supervisor Fewer's legislation. County Jail 4 was already slated to be shut down in July 2021. Now it will be shut down in November of 2020. Also, this legislation says that in case of an increase in numbers, there can be a contingency plan put in place, but this plan cannot include transferring people to another county or adding new jail beds to the system outside of the rehabilitation of an existing facility. In other words, this is legislation that is thinking long-term about decarceration in the city and county of San Francisco. Because outside this pandemic, we also have a longer-term public health issue, and that is the public health crisis that is incarceration itself. Good afternoon, and welcome to The Briefing, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Professor Jody Armour, and I'm excited to be here with our guest today. Today we'll be talking about incarceration as a public health crisis. Closing jails and reducing mass incarceration now in the time of the coronavirus, number one, and number two, reducing our reliance on incarceration in the future. We'll be joined by Chesa Boudin, the District Attorney of San Francisco, and San Francisco Supervisor Sandra Fewer. So to talk about incarceration in the short term and in the long term, let me give a further introduction of our guest and dive into some questions with him. First, Chesa Boudin, the District Attorney of San Francisco. Boudin is one of a growing number of DAs advocating reforms to reduce mass incarceration and address the racial and economic inequities the criminal justice system breeds. Boudin enthusiastically supported the rapid closure of County Jail number 4, describing it as inhumane. Chesa, you were inaugurated on January 9th, 2020. I remember well. It was big news around the country in criminal justice reform circles. 8 weeks into office, you were hit with a pandemic that demanded an immediate response. Can you talk about what your office has done in that time to respond to this unprecedented crisis?
Well, thank you, Professor Armour. It's great to be with you again. I wish we could be on stage in person. That's my preferred way to share space with you. But it is great to be here and great to be talking about such an important issue. Here's what we did in San Francisco. We did what I wish the President of the United States and other elected officials across the country would have done when this pandemic hit. We spoke with public health officials, we spoke with public health experts, and we tried to follow their lead to let them help us navigate our communities through this public health crisis. We worked hand in hand with other justice partners, other department heads, members of the Board of Supervisors, the public defender, the courts, and we followed the science. We understood that the county jail, like every county jail in this country, presented the very real risk of becoming an epidemic within the pandemic. And to avoid that real risk, we knew, as the director of the jail medical services told us in writing, we had to significantly reduce the county jail population in order to save lives. Since the pandemic began, we have worked in San Francisco with our partners to reduce the population in the jail by approximately 40%. All the while, crime rates have also been falling. The current jail population in San Francisco is now in the neighborhood of 700 individuals, a level we have not seen since the 1950s. There are just 9 children housed in juvenile hall right now, a facility that was originally built for 150. We did that through hard work, making individualized case-by-case decisions, working with reentry partners to ensure that folks who did not need to be in jail could be safely released and transitioned back to the community.
Well, yesterday, DA Boudin, and those are striking figures, by the way, I just have to comment, but yesterday you had an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times in which you talked about incarceration, even beyond this pandemic, as a crisis. Can you talk about this a little more, what remarks you made in that op-ed, please?
Well, Professor Armour, as you're aware, I ran for district attorney last year with a commitment to help close County Jail 4, with a commitment to help end mass incarceration, to move away from our country and our county's reliance on incarceration as a primary response to social problems like mental illness and drug addiction and poverty. And I did that because I understood that mass incarceration actually makes us less safe. It increases crime. It destroys communities. It bankrupts local governments. It actually provides a terribly cold comfort to most crime victims and distracts us from investing in healing the harm that crime causes in communities and to individual victims. And so what COVID-19, what this pandemic has taught us, is that mass incarceration also presents, in addition to all those things, a very real public health threat.
So there's an issue of too many people in jail or prison, all right? But there's also one of sentences being too long. You wrote that 10 years of incarceration is a significant sentence. Can you talk about the particular issue of extreme sentences in this country, both during this pandemic and in general?
The United States leads the world in locking people up. In this country, we have less than 5% of the world's population, and yet more than 25% of the world's prisoners. It's something that touches almost every life in every community. The majority of adults in the United States have an immediate family member who's either currently or formerly incarcerated. We've gotten used to, we've normalized the experience of incarceration, and we've even normalized the experience of life sentences or 75 years to life. So the idea of giving someone a 25-year sentence, which is the maximum in most European countries, it's what's considered a life sentence. Here, people treat that in many circles as though it's a light sentence, as though it's soft on crime. We don't consider the fact that people can change. We don't consider the fact, as we should do, that someone who commits a crime at the age of 18 is a totally different person after 10 years of incarceration or 12 years by the time they hit the age of 30. We are spending billions of dollars to house people who represent no public safety risk. There is a tremendous economic and human cost to doing that. Prosecutors and criminal justice officials must stop normalizing these draconian punishments that do nothing to heal the suffering victims have experienced, that do nothing to promote public safety, and that undermine our ability as a community to invest in proactive, preventative approaches that avoid crimes in the first place.
Let's turn to Sandra Lee Fewer, a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, representing Supervisorial District 1. Supervisor Fewer worked as an advocate for youth for years, and from 2008 to 2016, served as a member of the San Francisco Board of Education. Supervisor Fewer was elected to the Board of Supervisors in 2016. Supervisor Fewer, can you describe the conditions of County Jail Number 4, please?
Yes, hello, Professor Armour, thank you for having me today. Built in 1958, the Hall of Justice, the building in which County Jail Number 4 sits, was declared seismically unsafe by city engineers in the 1990s. A city report from 2012 estimated that a 7.9 magnitude quake on the San Andreas Fault during the workday would lead to more than 100 injuries and up to 25 deaths. But more than 20 years later, the building is also infamous for its horrendous sewer problems, among a host of other issues, including asbestos, lead, rodents, and more. Workers there have complained repeatedly of urine leaking through the ceiling. Inmates there sued the city in July 2018 over sewage problems. Our city administrator has said that she wanted the jail closed by the end of 2019. And our former Sheriff Hennessy called the facility depressing, decrepit, and an embarrassment. Every city leader in San Francisco agrees that this facility should have already been closed, but there wasn't a plan to do it. Now our legislation requires closure by November 1st by reducing the population and preventing the transfer of incarcerated people to out-of-county jail facilities, which would be a nightmare.
Supervisor Fewer, San Francisco was quick to join other counties in the Bay Area to shut down your city. Significantly, it seems that you and your colleagues did not forget that people who are incarcerated and staff who work in the county jails also need to be protected in order to protect everyone in San Francisco. This has not been the case elsewhere. How and why was this important to you and your colleagues?
I think my colleagues and I share the commitment in San Francisco to caring for our most vulnerable communities. In the age of COVID-19, that has to include people in congregate settings, seniors in residential care facilities, individuals in homeless shelters, residents in SRO hotels who share bathrooms and kitchens, and certainly those inside county jails, both incarcerated people and employees. I was working on this issue, though, for months before COVID-19 hit the Bay Area, and is part of what motivated me to throw down for Chesa in his race for district attorney.
Great. Now, many have said that incarceration really represents a failure. It means other systems have failed, whether that is education or mental health or healthcare systems. How do you see your role as a local elected official to fund and support these systems so that we don't end up funding incarceration and turning jails and prisons into receptacles of our social failures.
As policymakers, it is so rare that we get to have conversations about a root cause analysis for crime or for poverty. It is rare that we talk about systemic racism. But to address these glaring problems in our criminal justice system, we must talk about these things. This is why last year I authored legislation to create the first Office of Racial Equity in San Francisco to address the glaring racial disparities in all of our systems, including the criminal justice system. And we must talk about all kinds of investments that we are choosing to prioritize as a city. We are prioritizing more police or jail expansion, or are we prioritizing the kind of investments that can prevent crime on the front end? Investments in economic security, job pathways, mental health, and substance use treatment programs. And then on the back end, we know that once a harm has been caused, we need to invest in true accountability measures and support to help repair the harm done and prevent it from happening again. Jail doesn't do that. Look at the numbers of individuals coming in and out of the justice system. If it's meant to rehabilitate, it's clearly not working. The failure of these systems are really a reflection of the failure of our society. When we look at the jails and who is incarcerated, people of color, young people, poor and low income, people with mental illness, unhoused people. This is our collective failure, and we have to own that responsibility.
Supervisor Fewer, you have an exceptionally strong background in education, and recently you and your colleagues had another historic vote. You voted to actually shut down juvenile hall in San Francisco. Can you talk about that, please?
Sure. A series of reports had showed that juvenile crime was way down and that the numbers of young people incarcerated there was so incredibly small. The facility itself was 2/3 empty, that we were spending an incredible amount of money on this facility, over $300,000 per child. And that unfortunately is mimicked too closely a punitive and unforgiving adult criminal justice system. When Supervisors Ronan, Walton, and Haney introduced this legislation, it was timely and reflected the trend across the state in dramatically shifting the way we think about juvenile justice systems and the need to invest in the next generation. I worked for Coleman Advocates for Children and Youth for many years, and when the organization was leading on juvenile justice reforms, including fighting an expansion of the youth detention facility and winning the creation of an alternative to detention model. This idea of locking up young people and throwing away the key, specifically Black and brown young people, is a failed approach to responding to young people who make mistakes, sometimes big ones. I also fought for an expansion of restorative justice with Coleman Advocates while on the Board of Education. We ultimately need to find ways to invest in the well-being and development of young people and our communities rather than throwing them away.
So San Francisco votes to shut down its juvenile hall. Now you come out with this vote. What does this say about how San Franciscans are viewing incarceration as a solution to social issues?
I think we learned some lessons from the juvenile hall closure. And also, truthfully, this was an easier push in many ways because no one could argue that this crumbling building should remain open. But yes, I think the closure of both of these facilities, as well as the election of District Attorney Boudin, indicate that San Francisco and San Francisco residents want not only a safe city, but also one that addresses systemic root causes to prevent crime and ensure that our communities are no longer harmed by the effects of incarceration. Last year, the San Francisco Health Commission passed a resolution declaring incarceration as a public health issue, and COVID-19 has only increased those public health concerns.
Thank you, Supervisor Fewer. I'm going to return to DA Boudin for a moment. Chesa, you have taken a position of leadership across the country on this issue of decarceration to save lives. Yesterday, you wrote that governors could be doing a lot more to decarcerate their state prisons. Can you elaborate, please?
Absolutely. You know, criminal justice policy and decision-making for far too long has lacked the kind of bold, long-term vision that we see in Supervisor Fuhr and her colleagues on the Board of Supervisors. Instead, most elected officials over the last many decades have made decisions about criminal justice policy based on fear, seeking to avoid the risk of one bad case that will capture headlines and imaginations, and defining all social policy, not based on data, not based on the most common occurrences and the average case, but rather on the exceptional outlier case, without paying attention to the overall detriment and risk to our communities and to our entire budget and policymaking process. And what we've seen is policies, one after another, that are defined by fear and exceptional circumstances rather than good long-term policy planning. We know that recidivism is a reality with the current approach to jails and prisons. We know that 99% of people who are arrested and booked into county jails will be released at some point. Until we start investing in reentry planning, in mental health treatment, in addiction services, and in providing people with a pathway to independence and success after their contact with the criminal justice system, we will be condemning all of our communities to high rates of recidivism and to ongoing cycles of crime and victimization. We need to start making policies that focus on prevention and on rehabilitation instead of narrowly committing ourselves to draconian punishments.
Let me return to you, Supervisor Fuhr. What do you see as the best thing that state and federal governments could do to aid local governments to reduce incarceration?
Well, first, the federal government can stop investing in private prisons and start investing in actual people. Locally, we struggle with funding for mental health beds and supportive housing, alternatives to detention like case management, trauma-informed programs, restorative justice. And then let's talk about our educational system, supposedly the great equalizer of our society, but chronically underfunded. These measures could actually help prevent us from putting people in jail. But more than that, it's an investment in people. It's an investment in lives. These are lives of people that should not be ignored. And also the needs should be addressed. I think that we struggle continually with funding for programs that actually can prevent people from being incarcerated. As Americans, I think we look for the Band-Aid all the time, but what we lose in that is that we lose lives and we lose livelihoods. And that, I think, is the most criminal and the most heartbreaking.
Let me direct a question to both of you now, please. Everyone has been in agreement that the jail has to be shut down because of its structural problems. But in 2015, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors voted against building a new jail and even rejected state funding to build one. That was a 6-5 vote, and the sheriff was strongly opposed. Then San Francisco District Attorney George Gascon supported closing the jail and spending money on diversion and increased mental health treatment. So activists have been at this issue for a long time. Can you talk about the role that community activism has played in this struggle, please? We could start with Chesa this time and come right back to you, Supervisor Fuhr.
Happy to start, Professor Armour. It's a really important question, and it's really important to remember that fundamental social change in criminal justice and in so many other areas of work is driven by grassroots movements. The ideas that I ran my campaign on, the policies that we've been implementing in my first few months in office, those aren't original ideas that I came up with. I'm simply amplifying the voice of millions who've been fighting against mass incarceration, who've been demanding more investment in community-based approaches that actually keep us safe and prevent recidivism. What we're seeing in this movement for criminal justice reform is not the high-profile election of a few leaders like myself and others, but rather the culmination of decades of hard work by community activists and organizers who understand what it takes to keep their communities safe and strong.
Supervisor Fewer?
Sure. My office worked incredibly close with the New Jail Coalition and Taxpayers for Public Safety on this legislation to close 850 Bryant. They were absolutely critical to our success in passing the legislation. Every piece of legislation I work on is hinged on an inside and outside strategy and should be informed by the communities impacted by the issue.
So this is going to again be to both of you, and I'm going to start this time with you, Supervisor Fewer, and then go to Chesa Boudin. There's a tendency in the right wing and in the mainstream press to dismiss San Francisco and say, oh, it's just San Francisco, as in they're so liberal and out of the ordinary. And yet, this city has led for decades on labor rights, gay rights, marriage equality, on being a sanctuary city for immigrants, to name just a few issues. Do you see this issue of questioning and limiting incarceration as another issue where others will follow San Francisco's lead as a bellwether city and jurisdiction?
Absolutely. What San Francisco does, the nation follows. First, they call us crazy, and then they follow in our footsteps. And this is why this type of legislation and the leaders that we have here are so important. San Francisco is not just important to California. San Francisco is important to the nation as we lead in these issues, and we lead proudly.
I want to echo what Supervisor Fewer said. San Francisco is a leader in so many areas, and we can and will be a leader in criminal justice reform. We have been already for many years in many ways. And in partnership with the Board of Supervisors, my office, our courts, our department, and so many other city agencies, we are building a model for the rest of the state and in the rest of the country to follow. A model that focuses on people rather than politics. A model that focuses on community rather than incarceration. A model that prioritizes healing and harm reduction rather than punishment and punitive retribution. We can do better, and we are doing better in San Francisco.
Terrific. Well, I really want to thank Supervisor Fewer and DA Boudin for sharing with us their thoughts, and not just their thoughts, their deeds. You've been on the cutting edge of some of the most important social justice legislation in the nation at this point. And you know, sometimes you look at the news and it seems nothing in the news but the blues. And there are a lot of blues in the news right now, but this is one of those rays of sunshine, one of those rays of sunlight that's come through the way you've been able to bring together justice partners and work together to make real reform on what I consider the civil rights issue of our time, mass incarceration, and doing something about it. So thank you very much for your input, and thank you for joining us. And again, thanks for our partners in making this product, this show possible.
Thank you.
Thank you.